So a little history lesson. The house I grew up in was red. It was a brick basement and base, but it was red. It was always deep red. It had white trim, and it was like that for most of my life. Until my mom had a thought, which, while not necessarily terrible, it didn't work exactly how she wanted, we'll say. For the trim, she found lobster bisque. It was this pinkish peach kind of trim, and she found this very deep, dark, mauve-like pink. It was very, very pretty, very beautiful, very dark, not very pink at all. And so because it was a good deal, you're laughing because you know where this is going. Because it was a good deal, she bought all of the paint that she would need for the house. And then we started painting the house. And I'll never forget the phrase that she kept uttering, "It will dry darker, don't worry about it." It did not dry darker. No matter how much we trusted the process or waited for a very raspberry, and when I say raspberry, I mean raspberry. And no matter how long we waited for it to dry, what we wanted to have happen, it didn't. And my mother stubbornly refused to change things because she had just spent money on paint, and then she had used a lot of it to have the house started to be painting. So now, I live in a pink house. All of my friends throughout middle school and high school, they knew that we were that family that lived in that pink house. And literally, myself, my sister, my cousins, all of our friends, we called it the same thing, the Barbie dream house. Because it was so pink. My mom wanted one thing. And she got something else, something she didn't expect, something that was different than what she wanted. And I think that the best lesson, other than test the paint before you use it, the best lesson here is that things don't always go according to the plan that we have. Things are different than how we expect them to be from time to time. And it's something that I think that people in general feel. And certainly I believe that that's what Christ is dealing with in the reading from Matthew this morning. I mean, we're taught buyer beware. We're taught to be smart about things and to look into things. But even with all of the planning that we can do, something changes. Something is different. It doesn't have to be the way that it actually is. Our expectations will, in fact, be shattered by this world from time to time. Now, is that necessarily a bad thing? No. Not all the time. In fact, sometimes it's good to have the status quo shaken up and to get something different than what we expected. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing in the text in Matthew today. Peter is listening to Jesus. All of the disciples are listening to Jesus. And by this point in the narrative, they know and understand that Christ is the Messiah, the long-awaited one. He's the guy they were waiting for to fix everything, as it were. They proclaim him as the divine Son of Man by now, and things are fine. And so Jesus feels comfortable enough to let them in on the ground floor, to help them to understand what is going to happen. Mainly, that he is going to be betrayed and martyred, and he will die. He will die and then be raised, yes, but he will have to go through all of that. In Peter's mind, this is loss. This is not winning. This is not the winning that the Messiah was supposed to do, right? Because the Messiah, as a political figure, was supposed to come in, kick all of the Romans out, and set up this state run by the Jewish people, for the Jewish people. They would have their own land and be in charge of their own land, reestablishing the earthly kingdom of King David. That's what is supposed to go on. And if the Messiah is supposed to do that, the Messiah can't very well do that if he's dead. So either Christ is the Messiah or he's not. And so for Peter's brilliance, he says, no. He takes Jesus aside and decides to give him a what for. You're not meant to lose here, Jesus. Now, at this point, they know they're not supposed to spill the beans, as it were, yet. There's this messianic secret that keeps going around, and Jesus tells them, don't tell anybody yet. We have to wait. It's not the right time. But they all know all of these things that Christ is here to do, and yet still, it's not enough for Peter. He wanted to win. And yet Jesus is telling them that effectively it's going to look like he's lost. And Peter doesn't like this. Peter doesn't like this because Jesus didn't come to make us sad. He came to help us out. He was a booster. And it is with that take in mind that Peter has this sidebar conversation and tells him, no, don't say that. That's not what's going to happen. It's interesting that one of the things that precedes this passage and precedes this dialogue is the temptation of Christ in the desert. Jesus was already tempted with power and wealth and things of this world. He already could have had those. And we know that because we did it last Lent, and we'll do it again when it comes up to Lent. Money, power, authority, all of these things. These were what was going to be given to Jesus. And yet, instead of taking them, he wholly rejected them. He didn't choose a crown. He chose a cross instead. The world has a set of expectations, and Jesus is telling them, this isn't going to happen the way you think it's going to happen. Whatever it is you think is going to happen, cool. That's your human preconceived notion. But I'm telling you right now, it's going to be different. He explains, if you want to be my disciple, you have to lose your life. You have to follow me. It shatters the expectation because what Jesus is saying is that in order to be a follower of Christ, the disciples and us as well are asked to do the same. Lose in order to win. Because as Christ points out, there's no point in having it all when you've lost the very thing that makes you who you are. People assume, mostly because of talking heads on TV, I think, that as long as you follow Christ, everything is going to go your way. It's sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, and rose-colored glasses, and warm fuzzies all the time. And yet here, Christ is saying, to follow me, you must lose your life for my sake. What does that look like? Because if we take this too far, if we take this to the extreme, what that means is we become these sort of cosmic punching bags, as it were. Is it a life of self-denial and being a martyr fully, to give of yourself until there's nothing left? Not exactly. There's a subtle nuance, and Christ is not calling the disciples to empty everything out as to who they are for Christ's sake. They are called to follow and emulate Christ, not to have some sort of superiority complex or to say, oh, poor me, I'm doing all of this for Jesus and I'm getting nothing in return. It's just because it's the right thing to do. That there are people that are hurting in this world, and why would anyone want to add more hurt in the world for that? The answer to what this might look like is actually, interestingly enough, found in Romans. And it's pretty simple. Christ, for all that he does, when asked what the greatest commandment was, instead gave two, which he boils down to love God and love people. And he says, on this hang all the law and the prophets. Everything that makes us who we are, Jesus says, stems from these two notions, that you love God and that you love other people. Those are the roots or the seed that the rest of the rules and regulations all follow from. Because everything can be traced back to either loving God or loving people. So that is the key. That is the starting point, the focal point where we have to start with. But what exactly does that mean for us today? Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Just be real. The words that are used here in the Greek talk about this hypocritical love that people can have, this unpure love. So if we want to be a follower of Jesus, it starts by loving really, loving authentically, loving purely people. From that, other things are going to flow from it. All of these things. When people persecute you, when they're mean to you, when they're nasty to you, what do? You don't curse them. You bless them. Why is that? Well, because even though they're mean and nasty and spiteful, you want them to be blessed because you genuinely love people. Live in harmony with one another. Don't be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than who you are. You're not better than anyone else. Be with those who don't have. Or as we hear in James, religion that is pure and undefiled is what? To care for the poor, the orphan, and the widow in their distress. Those without voice, those without power, those are the people that you are called to love on. Don't repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of it all. Live peaceably with all. I don't know about you, but that list is very hard to do. I spent 3 years in Pittsburgh, and I had to drive in Pittsburgh. And I don't know, it's a beautiful city, wonderful city, and issues with the football team, but that's neither here nor there. Wonderful city, beautiful city. They don't know how to drive. And I mean that like with as much love in my heart as I possibly can, because the national flower, the flower of Pittsburgh is the orange traffic cone, because you can't go anywhere without traffic being backed up because there's construction. And so, small town Appalachian boy, I go to the big city, I start driving, and I learned words and gestures that I didn't need to know. And my response was not to reply in kind, but I did the thing to heap burning coals on their head. I smiled and waved. And I figured if nothing else, even if it doesn't make them mad, they'll see that there's still some happiness in the world. The point to all of this is that following Jesus looks different than what we may think it is. Because we're called to act different. We're called to be different. We're not called to be on top of the world 24/7. We're called to just follow Jesus. And that looks like loving God and loving people. Real, unhypocritical love is the love that Christ shows us. And if we are going to be followers of Christ, then we are called to do that as well. And the problem is we're going to get pushed back from it. If you ain't first, you're last. Look out for number one. Step on whoever you have to get to the top. These are the things that we learn. We have heard it said that greed is good. This is the world in which we live in. And so when we come up to people and say, yeah, I love you in spite of you being a schmuck, we're going to get pushed back from that. And no, it's not right. No, it's not fair. It's not fair that you seem to be penalized for doing the right thing. But Christ never said any of this was going to be easy. What he did say was that it was going to be worth it. Not because of some super secret reward that we get at the end of the day. But here's the rub. When you treat people with kindness, when you're nice to them, and when you love not as the world does, but as Christ loves, that means you get to lay your head down on your pillow before you go to sleep with a clear conscience, knowing you did the right thing, even when people didn't necessarily deserve it. Or at least not deserve it to our standards. See, the fact is, we act like the Romans reading today because while the world says one thing, Christ says something else. And he says, simply put, to love. It's just going to be different than how some people think it is. So we love differently, we live differently, we love differently, we act differently, not because we're better or because we want to point to ourselves and say, look at how holy I am. We do it because it's right and it's kind and it's decent. There is so much pain in the world. We need to be subtracting from that equation, not adding to it. To do that, things are going to look differently. We're going to look differently. We're going to act differently because we are not acting in accordance with the wishes of the world, but we are acting in accordance with the wishes of Christ, who simply said, love people. Thanks be to the God who never shows up exactly how we expect. Amen.